Good Monday morning. This is Senator Dick Black, retired senator, and this is Monday, August the 21st, 2023. We usually, when we do these shows, we pick up on something that's very hot in the news, or often we hit it before it hits the news. But this is a little bit different, and I felt it appropriate that we deal with a very important topic that's not in the news right now, but it's something that it's a good time to observe what's going on. And so that we called the topic, why won't Ukraine put women in combat? It's not really so focused on Ukraine as it is on the whole notion of women being involved in mortal combat. So with that, this morning I have a very, very dear family friend, someone that I met in Europe during the Cold War when both of us were in Germany. And this is my friend Steve Maguire. Before we welcome here, I just want to mention that Steve is he is a former Army Ranger. Now, for those of you who are not deeply involved in military things, I would just tell you that the Rangers are the elite of the elite within the United States Army. If you wear the Ranger tab on your shoulder, it is indicative of someone who is tremendously accomplished. Officer, enlisted, it doesn't matter. Now, within that very elite group of Army Rangers, and there are not lots of them, Steve Maguire has the rare distinction of having been inducted into the Ranger Hall of Fame. So he is someone of enormous talent and intellect, someone who was wounded in combat, and so with that, Steve, welcome. It's always good to see you. Now, this morning, what we're going to talk about is a Washington Post article, and this is an article. It's actually a very good article from December of 2022, entitled "Ukraine's Military Policy Puts Women in the Headlines, but not on the front lines." And it goes on to say that the headlines are declaring that, quote, "Ukrainian women stand strong against Russian invaders," and on the front lines, women are often the first responders. But then it goes on to say that, but the reality on the ground is that the Ukraine war echoes the global historical pattern where national militaries, while they're willing to accept women in large numbers, it says they relegate women to roles that distance them from frontline combat. I don't like the word relegate because that suggests that somehow they're discriminating against the women and not permitting them to go and have their arms and legs blown off. And so I don't think relegate is a very good word. So I'd be a little critical of the Washington Post on that, because the war is not about the battle for feminist ideology. It's about very, very real, bloody encounters between men, typically. So with that, Steve, perhaps we could get some of your views on this.
Thanks. I've been following the Ukraine war since its very beginning, and our media, I find, is quite a bit different from the British media, but in tone, it really is not. They've just got a lot more coverage. Maybe it's because they're in Europe and we're over here. They're more interested in that kind that kind of thing. So that there is more coverage of it, but it's the same kind of coverage that you got with uh, the Vietnam War, where you've got report. They told us they brought the war to our living rooms. They really didn't. They had little clips of soldiers doing things on the front line, but they weren't on the front line. They weren't dying right there because the reporters themselves aren't going to go and embed like they did in other at other times. And this the same is true here. I was looking at one video last night. The reporters were 10 miles behind the line. And the reason was at the front line, they were under artillery barrage
Yes,
almost constantly, intermittently. So they had been up to the front line, but then they withdrew rather rapidly before the fighting began. Reporters don't want to be killed, and they've got a choice. They're not in uniform, and they're not being ordered to go and fight the Russians.
you
So
know, that's a good point.
given that, on the other,
That's a good point. I recall that
there's
we were in a week
go ahead.
long battle in Vietnam with I was with Charlie Company, First Marine Regiment, and we were in a very bloody series of battles that went on for a week with a very fine company of regular NVA, and we had a whole gaggle of members of the National Press Corps with us from, I don't know where, CBS, NBC, ABC, all this stuff, and and they came along because they wanted to see what was going on, and as we entered the area where we were about to go into battle, there was a rotor blade of a Marine helicopter that had been shot down, and it had a message from the Viet Cong written on the rotor blade. It said something, "You come here, you die," and as we passed under it, the Marines didn't think much of it, but it sure got to these members of the courageous press corps. And the next thing, we find ourselves in battle, and bullets are flying, and the press people went to the company commander and they demanded to immediately be evacuated. And so I was the forward air controller, and the company commander, he was very disgusted, but he came to me, he says, Black, he says, we got to get these guys out of here. So I had to call in Marine helicopters to risk their lives to come in and rescue a bunch of cowards. Now, of course, they didn't portray themselves as cowards on the evening news. They would just say, "Oh, look at this! We're out there and we're in the midst of everything," but they weren't, and they weren't actually getting battlefield coverage. The best of all of the war front video or photography at that time was taken by South Vietnamese who were hired to go in and risk their lives, and then the press corps, the ABC, CBS, NBC, they would sit there and say, "Oh, I was there, and here's my press clips," but they didn't take them. They were sending some poor South Vietnamese guy that paying $1 an hour to go out and risk his life. So I know what you're talking about. That
Buck an
the
hour. That was a handsome wage in those days. I had a similar experience. I went out with a group of Japanese reporters from their network NHK. Um, they showed up in dress pants, dress shoes, and white shirts. Plus, they had the crew, and they had don't forget they had film. They had 16 millimeter film, and they had big heavy cameras, and the crew, a sound guy, and they had still photography and all kinds of expensive Nikon gear, and they we came up upon an area was very common in the Delta called Tudia, and the enemy would label it because they didn't want civilians going in there. It was booby trapped. And we went on in, and the Japanese, they decided they would stay in the village, and we would rendezvous with them later on. They, Tudia, liter, kind of is an idiom meaning land of the dead. Okay, they wanted no part of that, and that's fine. But I think that when they ran those films, whether it be back in Japan or back in the United States, they characterized it as this is the war. And a lot more of it was opinion uh, uh, than it was actual fact. Some of the videos you see out of coming out of Ukraine, however, are GoCam footage that real soldiers are taking into battle with them. That will show you a lot more about what it's really like at the front edge of the battle, where Russian soldiers can be seen. And they're shooting at each other, obviously, at that point. But that tells you a lot more. A lot of course, most of the there's no commentary. There's a lot of voices. It's all in Ukrainian and impossible to understand. But well, at least for me, and it is interesting. There are no women amongst those guys. So your choice of words there, the Washington Post using the word relegated, I'm surprised they used it. However, in some ways, it is accurate. Uh, Women are on the front line, but they're not fighting. And
yeah,
they've made a big thing about this, both in our army and theirs, because they champion the cause of heroic women, and they will cull out whatever snippets of information they can find that helps them make that characterization. You see it all the time. USA Today may be the worst at that stuff. They've got a gal over there that covers the military for a long time. Lolita Balzar or something along that. I forgot her exact last name. Her stuff is unreadable because it is so biased. Lolita is a cheerleader for women in the military. They're all heroic. They're all doing something unbelievably fabulous all of the time. So that's not news. That is not telling you anything about what really is going on. Okay, and we can get more into Ukraine if you want, because there's going to be between now and Thanksgiving, there's going to be some changes, and we don't know what that is. I heard somebody say yesterday, what happens if the United States doesn't give them any more money? Joe Biden has got a $20 billion package that's on the table right now. The House is, of course, Freedom Caucus is way opposed to it. The trouble is they're getting some Democrat support for this. A lot of Democrats have been over to the Ukraine on junkets, and they're starting to ask some very pertinent questions. Uh, if they start lining up with the Freedom Caucus in the House, Joe Biden's package could be in trouble. There are people talking no more money for Ukraine. It's a black hole. It's just sucking everything down. What happens? Well, the Ukrainians say we'll just put an AK-47 in the hands of every woman in the country. I don't believe that. I just don't believe that.
No. It's interesting. I was reading through all of the comments, well, some of the comments at the end of the Washington Post article, and I ran across one by a person, a man, I believe, who used the handle Hodlin, and I thought it was a very excellent summation, because he said, the separation of sexes in military conditions has been almost universal throughout history, seen in nearly every nation and culture. Then he said, Kurdish women do engage in combat, but it's often with their sisters. In other words, sexually segregated units. And there definitely have been some Kurdish women. I don't know how prominent it is, but I think they have had some. And then it made a very good comment. It says, moreover, when men and women are garrisoned together, we often hear of harassment. And I think ever since women began to be thoroughly integrated into the military, there has been a steady stream of comments about women being sexually harassed and abused. I think those things are often true, sometimes not always, but generally true, and inevitable. And they say, well, we've got to train the men, we've got to indoctrinate the men. Well, that isn't going to do anything. You got some men who are inclined that way, and you got some who are not inclined to abuse women, and you're not going to change their fundamental makeup. But anyway, this fellow who wrote the article, he had this final comment. He says, no one can predict the future, but we need a lot more evidence about how men and women serving together in combat react before we blithely assume that sex makes no difference. And I would say that the reason that I really picked out the Ukrainian war to discuss on this is that it's going on right now. There are reports from conservative circles that Ukraine may have had as many as 1/3 men killed, and their population is not that big to where that's just an enormous hit on the men. And now we've seen that. We saw this in World War II. We've seen it throughout history, where you have nations that are literally about to be destroyed, and yet they don't send out brigades of women, all these Amazons, to go and turn the tide of battle. And it's not that they wouldn't do it, because when you're at that final stage and your civilization is about to be destroyed, you're willing to do anything in order to survive. You look at Germany at the end of World War II. If they had thought for 1 second that sending divisions of women into the front would have turned the tide, they would not have hesitated an instant to do it. But they didn't. And you can go back to Roman times. All of these situations, and it's not because of discrimination or bigotry or patrimony or all these nonsense terms they throw around. It's simply the reality of the situation. And there are two things with when we discuss it in the halls of Congress. We always talk about the physical differences, which are, on average, very, very big and very important. But it seems to me, always has seemed to me, that the greater issue is the psychological interaction of men and women and how it distorts the warrior ethic of men in an all man unit on the front. Because when I made one of the last bayonet charges, I guess, in history, with Fox Company 1st Marine Division. And I just remember when, we were using the hand and arm signals, fixed bayonets. And I'm going to tell you, when I saw that signal starting to pass down the line, we were in a jungle hedgerow, faced against a rice paddy where we had to charge across the open. There was just this tremendous surge of adrenaline, and I gave the signal on to the next man and on down the line, and then took out my bayonet and snapped it onto the barrel of the rifle. And there is a sensation that goes over you at that moment that you're going to go across, you're going to attack across the field. And the field in front of us was littered with enemy dead, enemy weapons and things. And you're going to go across. You don't know what you're going to find on the other side, but you're either going to conquer or you're going to die, because you're not going to make it back across that open field. And I can imagine that for some men, if they had had a psychological excuse for not going, if they had, say there had been a woman who broke down sobbing, all of a sudden it was, you guys go, I'm going to take care of Mary because she's all broken up here. And you have these values that are at odds with one another, and you can't afford that when you're in battle. You can't have a sexual inclination to protect the woman when everybody else is going to go out and be dying and being shot down and that kind of thing. And so it's always seemed to me it's one of the most difficult things to explain, even among military people, because it's why do we go off? Why did the men go into Pickett's charge across that vast open field, knowing with almost certainty that they were going to die? And you charge forward and you keep charging. And there actually were a handful of men who made it across. I don't know how far they had to go. Whether it was 1,000 yards or something, wide open terrain, and they're marching off into just, horrendous gunfire and artillery fire, and people are falling on the right and the left. I think they may have had like a platoon or so that made it into the enemy trenches, where they were promptly all killed off. But there is a primal instinct among men to say, I'm going to keep going forward because I'm not going to be humiliated in front of my buddy Steve Maguire. And Steve Maguire is going to be thinking, I'm not turning back because I'm not going to be humiliated in front of my buddy Dick Black. And we both go and we're both blown to smithereens. Not the objective of the battle. The objective is to win, but sometimes the result is that you and I get blown to smithereens. But neither one of us wants to see, Mary Smith hurt on the battlefield. And when that happens, all of a sudden, this this sort of almost this military hypnosis to drive on, and all of a sudden something breaks that psychology, and all of a sudden we're diverted to, men protect women. So, and frankly, it's a lot safer to stop here and protect the woman than it is to continue marching into the enemy guns. So,
A lot of this has not yet been tested. Not in the scenarios that you've been describing, or even taking bayonets out of the equation, which are relatively rare. Uh, Regular combat, we were told during the Iraq War, women are in combat. Well, they were not in combat, they were at combat. Riding around in Humvees and getting the vehicle blown up and getting wounded, that's a form of combat, but it is not really active combat. It's not going after the enemy, engaging them, and killing them, or being killed yourself, or severely wounded. And everybody fears that. There's a tremendous amount of fear involved in it. But men have been doing this since time immemorial. Since the days of Alexander the Great, going into battle with short swords and just hacking people to death. Or conversely, being hacked to death yourself. And the carnage was amazing, but men did it, and men continue to do it. We're seeing it in Ukraine right now. Ukrainian guys going up against Russian forces and killing and being killed in large numbers. And you mentioned 3/4 of a million was in the New York Times. I guess over the weekend or maybe Friday. 500,000 Ukrainians dead so far. They haven't been reporting on a lot of that stuff. They're reporting on it now. 500,000 is civilians as well as their soldiers. I've seen lots of stuff about how many Russians got killed. How come we knew about all the Russian casualties and we didn't know anything about the Ukrainian? Okay. The Ukrainians have been suffering a great deal, and they've got a much smaller population to draw upon. The Russians will draw upon a much larger population, and they've been doing that. We hear reports about lots of desertions and all that kind of stuff. Sure, but that doesn't characterize the whole. The Russian population has a history of being able to waste men in combat. They'll just do it, and they're doing it right this minute. And they will overwhelm their enemy ultimately. And that's what they did with Germany. You mentioned Germany earlier. Yeah, they didn't commit their women. They committed the Volkssturm, the old men and the young Hitler Youth kids who were like 16 and 17. They put a uniform on them and they put them in charge of guarding bridges and that kind of thing. They were reluctant even to put them there. The women didn't go in combat because if they're killed, your nation is killed. The women and the children who were left, the younger ones, were going to be the new nation that exists today. That's Germany. All right. You spill the blood of all those women, you don't have a nation. And it saw that at least they would have a future if they surrendered. And they did. It was the only rational thing to do at that point for them. I think Ukraine is going to be shortly in a situation like that. They say And I'm reading the media. I don't believe a lot of what I read in the U.S. media. I don't believe most of what I mean, the Russian media is all propaganda, but so is ours. Uh, they were talking, they've got reserves of 750,000 men. They're not in uniform now because, oh, they don't have enough uniforms, or they've got all kinds of excuses for why they they're running out of men, and at the same time they've got a pool of 750,000 they can draw from. I don't get that. So we're going to see some changes along the way here. I think that are pretty significant. Uh, Let me talk more about the propaganda of this. They we were through the winter last winter. We were told they're going to have a big spring offensive. All right. And when the snow melts, the offensive's going to begin. Can't do anything when the snow on the ground. Right. Okay. So we gave them all kinds of armored vehicles. We gave Bradleys and stuff like that, and Strikers and stuff. We're drawing down our own military just to feed the Ukraine this giant maw that's eating up everything. Uh, Meanwhile, the Russians aren't stupid. They were building a defense in depth, and rows upon rows of hundreds of thousands of mines planted in the ground, trenches and artillery, typical military defensive operation. Breaking into that is extremely difficult. So our generals said, what you got to do is combined operations. We can do that. The U.S. military can do that. We've been practicing and training for it for decades. We can do it. We've got the communications, and we've got the equipment, and we've got the training and a manpower, etc. We got everything. They don't. And it's not something that you say, okay, you guys, we got 2 weeks to get this done. We're going to do combined operations. You see some of these GoCam footages. There's a lot of U.S. equipment burned out and blown up by mines in particular. And they lost a lot of men. Their generals decided, wait a minute, we're losing a tremendous amount of men here. We can't keep this up. Our generals were saying, no, keep going, keep going. You're going to break through. You're going to pierce their lines eventually. The Ukrainians decided that they weren't going to pay that price. They want to chip away here and chip away there. They've gained little. They've made a little gain, but only a little. And now they want to go to Mariupol. That's fine, but the Russians know about that, and they will be ready. And they've got a lot more. They're out. They can outblast them with artillery like 10-1. They've got the ammunition. They're getting that from China now, and we've got two factories that make 155 projectiles. Both of them are, I believe, in Pennsylvania. They're working flat out, but they're antiquated. These arsenals are antiquated. They don't produce like we produced in World War II.
Now we've gotten into using all of these enormously complex, expensive weapons that maybe they're marginally better than the ones the other side uses, but they can produce 4 tanks for the price of one of ours. Maybe it's more than 4 tanks. I'm not sure, but it's a lot.
You're right. This scale is very different. And,
Yeah.
a lot of their stuff got blown up on the way to Kyiv and all of that. We heard all that stuff. The Russians had a lot of problems back in 2021. This is 2023. They are not stupid. They've made adjustments. And they're ready now. And they're training their people as we talk. And I they're going to have to make some Ukraine's going to have to make some hard decisions. then
Well,
there may be a Russian counterattack. We have not, we've seen part of it with Wagner earlier this year, but we may see an actual Russian counteroffensive. And that'll come from wherever they choose. They're talking now that Wagner has moved into Belarus. And the Belarusian border is not that far from Kiev. And they may rethink that whole pincer attack from the north. If they do that, Ukraine is going to have their hands full, no question about it. And they're going to be asking NATO to come and get involved in that kind of thing. I don't know. I think there's people in the United States who would answer that call or willing to. I don't think Europe is. They are very afraid of escalation, rightly so. If you can predict what Putin will do, you're a better man than I. I don't know what he will do, nor the hardliners that are his that surround him. So we're gonna see some. You don't hear much news because it kind of ground to the offense, the spring offensive ground to a halt, and they're just trading artillery shells right now. All right, we're going to South Korea and ask them for 500,000 rounds of ammunition, which they need. They have a huge stockpile, so we've asked them for 500,000 rounds. That'll go, but the way they're firing these things in Ukraine, that won't last long. Then what? I don't know.
Well, Steve, I think with that, we're probably going to have to wrap it up here, but really appreciate your comments. I think certainly the war in Ukraine is reaching a point where Politico reported just the other day about all of a sudden the conflict within the White House and within the whole foreign policy establishment. Some people are coming to grips with the fact that that Ukraine has lost the counteroffensive and perhaps has lost the war. Others continue to feel the other way, but there's starting to be a break in the solid wall of unity.
The CIA put out a report, and it was very, very damning. And they put it out. They put it out to the New York Washington Post, which is their mouthpiece for putting stuff out and trial balloons and all kind of thing. And it was a very damning report. The White House has got a whole bunch of people over there on National Security Council that have no idea what they're doing. A bunch of non-military thinking people, and they don't. So there's a lot to this. Then there's the funding, which is stirring up a lot of trouble in Congress. So where they go from here, I don't know, but this is going to happen in the next couple of weeks.
Well, we'll find out soon. With that, thank you very much for being with us today, Steve Maguire, Army Ranger Hall of Fame, and in any event, we will certainly be hearing more about Ukraine in the near future, and we'll be doing some reporting on that. So with that, I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and we will look forward to being back with you next Monday at 11.